Hey everybody, welcome back to the Restart Pod. Today we are having a good old discussion about peptides. Both Damon and Damon more than I, has a pretty bio background. For those who don't know, he has a PhD in biomedical engineering. Um, I don't have as much credential aside from being a big weightlifter, so the community I'm a part of has a lot of this sort of discussion in it. I also did biochem for a little bit, so I guess some level of fascination. Peptides are obviously really, really huge. There's this wider cultural trend that is happening around health space specifically, and a lot of that has to do with what's happening in peptides, whether that's marketing, whether that's actual science. There's kind of a lot to kind of dig into. I kind of want to break it down, I think, structurally, breaking the conversation to like what's the actual science, what's happening in industry, and what's happening in culture. Because I think all of those three things are pretty nuanced as far as how folks are reacting to things. But Damon, given you're the doctor on the call, um, maybe just give us like a little wind up for those who aren't aware of like, hey, I've heard about this peptide thing. Like,
Yeah.
why should I care about it?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, a lot of the interest in peptides stems off of the success of the GLP-1 drugs, right? GLP-1s are originally kind of a medicine that was used to treat severe diabetes, but as they became more and more studied, both directly and indirectly, it became quite obvious that they had kind of these off target but highly beneficial effects, right? Primarily for weight loss, but apparently other things as well, right? Maybe even reduced risk of dementia, which could be incredible, Alzheimer's prevention. Like this, there's kind of a laundry list of potential benefits for GLP-1s. And GLP-1s are somewhat interesting in that, historically speaking, as a broad generalization, drugs kind of fall into two camps. They're basically small molecules or they're antibodies. Obviously, there
Mhm.
are others, but again, just for general conversation and table setting for this conversation, you have small molecules and you have antibodies. Small molecules and antibodies kind of exist on both sides of a polar size spectrum. Small molecules are small, kind of adequately named. Peptides fall in between the size of these small molecules and much larger antibodies, and there are good and bad. Historically, I think that most researchers, and to be clear, this is not exactly my area of expertise. Like my PhD was in hardware software for medical devices. It wasn't really in therapeutics. That said, I obviously had a lot of exposure to it. There were folks sitting next to me working on therapeutics all the time with technology that was like similar to the technology we were leveraging for our devices. But the point being is historically peptides, rather than kind of getting the best of both worlds, got the worst of both
Hmm.
worlds, of the small molecules and the proteins, proteins being the antibodies in this case. Um, and again, what you get with these larger macromolecules, these antibodies, proteins, is more stability. They kind of usually last longer in the body. They're not degradable. Again, generally speaking, not as degradable. They have longer half lives, therefore they elicit a stronger response. And then on the counter, small molecules, they tend to be able to target things that are not targetable via these
Right.
larger things, because sometimes the pockets that need to be bound in a biological setting are quite small, or they're hard to get to, or whatever. Um, so again, historically, these peptides that exist kind of in the middle of that spectrum, or at least somewhere in between the two ends of that spectrum, have been kind of the worst of both worlds, except for kind of GLP-1. And these
Mhm.
GLP-1s have kind of shifted that paradigm. So I think it's creating a lot of interest in alternative peptides, and you kind of get these two camps, and many more camps than this. But again, just for this conversation, two camps of peptides are generally bad, but GLP-1 is the exception, or the counter is GLP-1s are this unlock to making what was previously, a reasonably ineffective tool, peptides, now effective. And so I think that's kind of where the conversation divides. And so I'll pause there for questions or comments. Lots to digest and debate, but that's kind of, I think, a decent kind of intro.
Yeah, the thing I'd say for everyone listening is that like peptides aren't new. Like they've been like insulin is a peptide. Like a peptide is just fundamentally like when Damon's saying like small molecule, like any one of these things of this variety is like set of amino acids. Like if you go get Greek yogurt, that's just a protein filled with a bunch of amino acids. You eat it, those amino acids don't get processed by your endocrine system, but when you inject it and you have these like very specific created chains, your body has receptors all over its different cells, all that sort of stuff. Each cell has its own like, I guess, door and key set effectively that these amino acids, when chained the right way, will work as keys to certain doors, right? And so what we're seeing, I mean, GLP-1s, the fascinating thing about them, I believe they were originally being like tested for diabetes, but they saw a weight loss effect because it had an effect on ghrelin, it had an effect on your like hippocampus and your hunger state, had an effect on like satiety and motility in your gut. That all in all ended up creating the effect of weight loss, right? And now that's on market, and being really cool. I think what has happened, I don't know if this is necessarily, so maybe we'll talk a little bit like culture first. I think that maybe feels like a right place to start. Um, in like fitness and health, there has always been this sort of like alternative gray market lane. Like creatine was kind of the first of it. Creatine kind of got like a lot of its like medical proof and trials and all this other sort of stuff done around it. That now creatine as a supplement, like a thing to add to your wellness plan, I suppose, is fairly well established as a pretty safe thing for most athletes for the sake of recovery, for the sake of development, all that kind of stuff, right? That's good. GLP-1s are obviously fairly nascent. Insulin has existed for the longest time. Um, I think by virtue of what like the branding of peptides are and the way that like some slices of like the wellness community and the way like influencer like communities are working, is that what we're kind of seeing is the emergence of like a new almost market trend of, we see people who are taking clinical trial data, or not even clinical trial data, like animal model data or like theoretical model data on like patients who are not in like the general population, like HIV patients or like elderly citizens, seeing an effect of an old peptide and assuming that that is something that is generally broadcastable to a lot of the media audience. And on all of a sudden, we have like the Wolverine stacks and retatrutide and a number of these other things that haven't gone through the FDA process, but you have people anecdotally touting, oh, here is something that's kind of interesting. I'm going to use it to make my muscles bigger, have a better physique, or have tighter skin and all this kind of stuff. That isn't well supported in any capacity. I think there's a kind of a lot to dig into there, but we're seeing a number of even startups in the space like playing around with like, we're going to become like a peptide market almost, which is very new and like almost like a new slice of consumer in the day and age of AI effectively.
Yeah, there's a lot here. So kind of follow me on this
Yeah.
journey, if you will, a bit. So I um, there is a cultural lens that bleeds over into I think the things that we've lived through in the recent 5+ years dating back to COVID, the things that happened around the COVID vaccines that are now leading us to the time that we exist in with peptides and these kind of, like you're aligning gray market self experimentation,
Mhm.
booms, if you will. There's also, not to be forgotten, a pretty clear business path to marketing and selling these very high margin products in a way that also kind of muddies the water a little bit, so to speak, here. So again, table setting a bit, we have seen institutions like the FDA, like the NIH, like organizations that would have historically been intellectual or approval gatekeepers for medicines that go into our body, losing trust since
Yep.
the COVID vaccine, kind of debacle, if you want to call it that. Saying nothing about whether that trust uh, should be regained or should not be regained, what is leading to a lot of the self experimentation is the lack of trust for folks in these organizations having our best interest kind of first and foremost, right? They think they're inherently profit driven. They think they kind of are inherently biased, and they think that they are gatekeeping what could be, unlocks such as the Wolverine stack or these other kind of adjacent peptides to GLP-1s from the public until, some company, one of the big pharmas or otherwise can profit from it. There's probably a little bit of truth in that, kind of like any great conspiracy. There's a little bit of truth at the core
Mhm.
in it. Like the FDA is fundamentally inefficient. Like I don't think anyone would argue that the FDA is perfect by a long shot. And then similarly, because of the success of GLP-1s and others, there is a growing body of evidence that these peptides can be effective. So to your
Yep.
point, like creatine works pretty well documented, didn't really follow the trend, quote unquote traditional FDA pipelines. Like why couldn't something else do that. The risk in that is that it leads to these somewhat nefarious, kind of almost inherently shady actors understanding that supplements and supplement adjacent products, i.e., peptides in this case, are incredibly high margin. So it's
Yeah.
incredibly easy to build a business so long as you can capture consumer attention. And we have
Yep.
seen a recent explosion, recent being the last, again, 5 to 10 years, of this influencer first CPG brand economy where somebody cultivates an online following, maybe manosphere adjacent, maybe health first fitness blogger adjacent, right? Where they have a captivated audience that are following them for health tips or otherwise, and throwing their name on a white labeled peptide is something that can be done.
Yep.
And the danger in that is you don't know the manufacturing. You don't really know where the kind of feedstock, raw source material for these peptides is coming from. You don't know the purity levels, right? And so what you end up with is this kind of bulk self experimentation, landscape where people are putting things into their body that can't be fully vetted, and you really don't know the full effects of yet. That's not
Yeah.
to necessarily say we should discourage all self experimentation, but there should be some level of, yeah, I don't know, quality control.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Even if we don't know the full effects of these things, just knowing that what you're actually putting into your body is the thing that you think you're putting into your body is probably a decent place to start. And
Yeah,
so,
like getting these things off like TikTok Shop
yeah,
is verifiably crazy if it's going
yeah,
directly into your blood. Like that's
right,
like
yeah,
without moralizing, like that is an insane thing to generally be doing. And we're seeing, I mean, like so two things. There's like the med spa culture, right? There's like a level of this which has like been crafted into like a luxury experience that you can go to a very like homey place where there's like some sort of like not a full doctor, but some person with some sort of degree or like some sort of certification that allows them to um, have a practitioner role that you can get these peptides. Like they kind of like act as a gateway to these gray markets of peptides. Um, and you can get service of these things if you so desire. But like the thing you're describing, I mean, rightly so, like you are running an experiment of n equals one, and in a lot of cases, I mean, a lot of you kind of mentioned like the manosphere, the health sphere, right? One thing that gets like pushed around a bunch, like even just like for color, like I guess like if it matters, like in my fitness wellness, like I take creatine, like I have a protein powder, like I have vitamins, whatever. But I would never like do this sort of thing very specifically. And a lot of the dialogue gets passed around between like consumers, like, oh my god, I got up my growth hormone specifically. Growth hormone is not necessarily a thing you want. Like it sounds market wise like a thing you want to get really big and really, really strong. But like a growth hormone, for example, like is the same thing that can give you like an insulin resistance. It's the same thing that like can like mess with your joints. Like you don't want more of it all the time,
mm,
but it sounds like a thing that markets well. And it's just the terminology around it. And the number of peptides have supported the idea of like, oh my God, faster wound healing,
yeah,
like greater recovery because of growth hormone. That I think people, by virtue of like hearing anecdotes, one, you're missing any sort of like, I guess, favor that comes from like a placebo, a randomized clinical trial. That people who are giving anecdotes, they all know exactly what they're taking and they know the experience that they want to have, and their perception of that experience will obviously be up, right? And then when they tell those stories, everyone else is kind of going down the same perpetuating cycle, which ends up really, really dangerous, especially if you're doing something that ups your growth hormone. What happens if like you have a like cancerous polyp or something, and all of a sudden that has a receptor to the peptide you're consuming? Like super, super scary, right?
mm. Yeah. The balance and the challenge with biology, which is why, in some ways, why it takes so long to do the drug approval process, is most drugs exist in like what you would consider a Goldilocks zone, meaning too little, not good, too much, also not good. And so knowing that on an individual basis, like part of the FDA studies don't just vet efficacy, meaning they don't just vet does the drug actually work. They also vet to what levels is this healthy for the generic, the general human to take. Now, again, there are problems with that, and I actually do think, not to bring this conversation away from the core peptides that we're on today, but artificial intelligence has an opportunity to make this more effective, to make more
Yeah.
of the N of one studies actually verifiable. and to make
Yeah.
more of the N of one studies the kind of the direction to go, such that people that can benefit from these drugs or other drugs, um, or other drug, supplements, let's call them, um, can get access to them. Because again, I think there is some careful thought that needs to be, um, I guess, deliberated around. Yes, we probably need gatekeepers in some respect for the things that we are putting into our bodies, at least in the quality control phase. But that said, the gatekeepers can't be so strong such that folks that are okay with the risks so long as they're known can't act on their own kind of autonomy, right? Like I do
Right.
think some level of self experimentation is healthy so long as the person that is undergoing the self experimentation understands what they're doing.
Yeah. And so like we can kind of transition to like the industry element there because I mean the evidence I keep coming back to is like should be like history that people who are engaging this stuff have read on. Like insofar as like understand you're playing with your literal hormones and your like signaling pathways in your body, and that can be a very permanent thing. It can be a really high impact thing. Um the one like pharma like the one gigantic argument for why the FDA should exist to me was always like the thalidomide scandal back in I think the 60s, 50s maybe. Um where there's a drug prescribed for pains for pregnant women. And it was kind of sold as a wonder drug, marketed very, very heavily, like went across the nation, whatever. And then number of months after the fact, like and all the babies of those pregnant women were born with like massive birth defects, like really, really widespread. Like it ended up being like pretty disastrous almost. Um, that kind of like signaled like one, we need to rigorously test the width of anything we're producing. Two, we need to standardize the manufacturing pipeline of it so it can't have like zinc or arsenic inside of whatever we're producing. And then being able to like ship it out confidently for the average person to consume, right? Like that doctor can say, like, you fall in the profile of someone who should be using this thing. Your category of person has been tested against. Um, and so that way we deem it safe that for you to use this thing, like the side effects for someone like you should be fairly minimal or whatever it may be.
Mhm.
Um, kind of talking about the AI thing, that I think that's a relatively interesting like upgrade from the conversation where I do like the FDA is slow. I also think that there is like a difficulty in what a clinical trial is that most people participating in these clinical trials have to have one, the interest to nominate themselves for these clinical trials. And two, like have to be seeking like generally like clinical trial recommendations comes from your practitioner, right? You are someone with a pretty harsh case of something or another. That something or another has a clinical trial coming up. Your doctor deems it pretty okay for you to participate in it. If you're willing, they'll do the education for you, and then you self-elect effectively to participate in a clinical trial. That's the modern way of doing things. I think the nuance of what this like peptides again as a catch-all term, but this like wider health trend of like almost these like micro optimization drugs, like the vast majority of people who are like spending a lot of money on GLP-1s aren't obese, right? They're people who
Mhm.
want like the aesthetics, they want like the vanity element of the drug to be working for them. Um, in those sort of situations, one, I think it's unlikely that that person's going to a doctor to self-nominate for a clinical trial, even though they would be. And two, the current clinical trial system doesn't naturally end up giving you breadth of biology, right? Like every body is very, very different. Like especially like the nervous system between person, for instance, is so different. Um, and there is something I think to be said about like in an AI native world, if you have like an AI doctor, that sort of thing, that like especially if you have like very niche interests or niche concerns about your medical care effectively, there is a wider opportunity for you to like get personalized medicine that a peptide available in a clinical trial or that sort of thing could kind of find its way to you, and all of a sudden you can kind of elect for it and go through a rigorous process that the way you're collecting data on yourself ends up contributing back to the like research pool in a way that's meaningful, right? Direction that's pretty interesting, right? Like that's a promise aligned with personalized medicine. It's
Mhm.
in alignment with the way I think a medical system of the future would kind of generally work. That if you are a fit for a very niche drug, you have a way to get to it, and your
Mhm.
data, assuming you're not putting yourself at major risk, can contribute back to the pool and make that drug safer for everyone as well. you know. Um,
Yeah,
Good.
the optimistic outlook for AI in health and medicine is access where it wouldn't otherwise exist,
Hmm.
verification where it's otherwise impossible, and personalization, as you said. Meaning, like the challenge in medicine historically, and there really isn't a way to unlock this problem like until maybe possibly potentially AI is that the drugs, the tests, the studies, the FDA approval studies, and otherwise do rely on statistical significant, large in studies. And as you're saying, that
Yeah.
kind of biases the sample towards a particular population. Number one, folks that qualify; number folks two that self-elect; three that actually adhere to the treatments as designed, that kind of thing. And there are no perfect studies, right? So there's obviously data miss and misalignments kind of all over the place. And yeah, and the reality is that most drugs, then by definition, are fit for kind of the median Gaussian or the standard of the bell curve, kind of the middle 50, if you will. And so therefore, there's are a lot of edge cases that aren't caught in the traditional pipeline, and frankly, those folks go kind of underserved. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Again, it's no one's fault. It just kind of is a product. And so the opportunity I think that's in front of us for AI or otherwise is helping folks get help they wouldn't or couldn't otherwise get.
Yeah. I think I want to talk a little bit about like just like culturally, I think what's happening. I mean, this is just me being like consumer oriented, I guess, but um I do think there is like an interesting wider trend to kind of look at here, like independent of what peptides are, the way the like the marketing of peptides works. I do think like this like longevity conversation is fairly interesting and like weird. Um I think like any like doctor would tell you like in trying to take care of your health, like it really is a matter of just like get the fundamentals right. Like sleep a healthy amount, go to the gym, have something in your life that gives you like good stewardship and pride in something, like eat whole foods, don't sit all day, get sunlight, that sort of stuff. Really is like 95% of health, like independent of like pre-existing conditions or like great medical difficulties, right? Um, I do want to like just like I say this as someone who's like in this culture, like this desire to spend for health feels like a thing that's like accelerating almost. Um, in a way that like it's some level of status to make it look like you spend a lot on your personal care. Um, that I think is interesting insofar as like when you look at like consumer use of GLP-1s, right? Again, outside of the independent and like obesity use cases and outside like without moralizing. Um, like if an average person's signing up for GLP-1s, there's some like consumer behavior of like I would rather pay for a thing and like have that shortcut towards the physique I want or the aesthetics I want. That I do also think kind of ignores like you're missing the 90% of the problem and hoping to spend your way to there. I mean, the same thing's happening with like protein in foods, like fiber in foods, that like the perception of paying for a thing ends up being a little bit more important than the actual practice of getting the desired outcome almost.
Yeah, generally speaking, because health and wellness are like nebulous terms and therefore hard to track. We've seen this proliferation in devices set out to track them: the Apple Watch, the Aura rings, the Eight Sleep mattresses, all as an example to kind of all try to coalesce towards some standard definition of you are more healthier today than you were yesterday, and those kind of things. And in
Yeah.
the absence of perfect metrics, what folks tend to do, and this is just human nature, is they try to simplify the complicated into verifiable metrics. Historically, those verifiable metrics have been weight, right? Did I lose weight or did I gain
Yeah.
weight? Which is, again, maybe a proxy of health, but certainly not an overall indicator of health, or dollars slash effort spent on health. Like to
Yeah.
your point, like what you do unlock in just a simple act of thinking about health or trying to engineer health, buying supplements, is you do engage the placebo effect, at least to some degree,
Yeah.
right? It may not be the entire thing, but simply the act of um, buying the supplement makes you think you are healthier because you spent time
Yeah.
thinking about your health, and then therefore that does have some downstream uh, consequences of you actually being healthier. Most studies do show that in the same way, if you make your to-do list, you're much more likely to complete things on the to-do list. If you buy the supplement, you are much more likely to engage in acts of wellness, lifting weights, going for a run, eating healthier, having your supplements, those kind of things. So there is a very simple cause and effect that the folks that um, incentivize themselves by means of spending money on those things to be more healthy, actually end up being more healthy just by simply the act of doing it. But you're right, it is mostly a derivative effect. It's not the actual effect of the supplement itself. It's the behavior that the purchasing of the supplement encourages, right? Is a downstream, again, kind of actually healthy acting that happens. I also think there is, we're coming up on an interesting inflection point to kind of circle this back to the AI of it all, because there's an unhealthy almost obsession with metrics optimization.
Hmm.
Metrics optimization and overall longevity aren't necessarily the same. Like the
Yes.
most beautiful Western physique is not the healthiest Western
Yep.
physique, right? Usually you're have too low of body fat. You're usually overtrained. You know, your joints kind of are a little bit um, overstressed typically in the kind of
Yep.
classic like weightlifting regimes and that kind of thing. Now, again, it's still better than sitting all day. So, please understand what I'm saying is like there again, there's like a Goldilocks, right? And usually the maximum Western aesthetic goes beyond the Goldilocks. It's overtrained.
Yep.
It's like six pack abs, all the things that like look good publicly, but aren't actually the most optimal for like a true health
It's
oriented
not
kind of.
steady state
Okay,
health.
correct,
Yeah.
correct. And so all that to say, I am slightly concerned that what we're headed for is a world in which we are optimizing for the wrong things. We're optimizing for
Mhm.
social media clicks, and we're optimizing for numbers on the scale when that isn't the exact same thing that's going to result in maximum longevity. That said, anytime people are turning their attention to their health, I think it's net good. And right now, we're just working through the kinks. All right, we're going to get there. We're just working
Yeah.
through the kinks. I do think, in a
Y-
slightly optimistic tone and a little bit deviating from the core of this conversation, I think we are living in an interesting generation and time right now, because I think we are kind of on the cusp of living for much longer than previously expected. Like I do think we are
mm,
potentially at a Cambrian explosion, to use a term that we like on this pod, um, of real medicine in a way that's going to significantly increase not just life, but also health spans in the foreseeable future. Like, I think there's a very real chance that our children or grandchildren live on average to 100 years old. I think that really can happen.
is your argument there that like I guess like there's a number of things that could be like primary arguments in that nature, but do you think it's like AI enabled drug development? Is it like level of like AI on body goes up? Like I guess like in you crafting that statement, what is like the top two of like contributing factors that are about to come that makes you say that with such confidence?
Yeah, it's mostly AI-enabled drug development. It's also the targeting the N of one, so it's like highly customized medicines that can actually
Mm,
help people proactively live longer. The thing that like bottlenecks proactive health right now is that the practicing providers in this country and in most countries don't have enough time to get to all the patients proactively. They're always like dealing with the problem as it's already happened. Very rarely are they spending any
right.
time on preventative medicine. We are undergoing a cultural shift to preventative medicine that, again, while rocky in the early days, I think will find steady state in being highly productive. Also, AI is a fundamentally democratizing technology that's going to allow the folks that are most interested in their health to engage with it, and that will have kind of trickle down effects, I think, to other folks. We're also going to do a lot, I think, in terms of checking off, maybe not in a true hierarchical nature, but in a fairly systematic way, the most common killers of humans,
Yeah.
especially early in life. Like we're gonna solve
That's
southern
yeah.
part of cancer, heart disease. Honestly, not really for this discussion, but we're also going to do things like eliminating car accidents that are going to push the
Yeah.
average lifespan while with autonomous cars. So
Yeah,
mostly all of
to
the
me,
above.
that's the most reasonable argument of like I think courtesy of like the longevity movement. I mean, I know folks who like work at pharma companies here or like at work at like novel drug startups. The like a lot of them will pitch themselves as longevity startups. But really, what like their argument is like they'll raise on the premise of longevity, but ultimately what they're actually pitching ends up being like we're working on a drug for this particular kind of death causing issue, right? Whether it's like a like neurological disorder, like a cardiac issue, that sort of thing, that like impacts enough of the population that if you were to like fix it, you raise the average lifespan by quite a bit, and also the health span in the years of suffering from that matter that like
Mhm.
drop. I think in looking at like the argument of like longer lifespans, longer health spans. Like, I don't know if that if you ask most people today that like the idea of like living for like in the current shape of it, like living another like 20, 40 something years is a pitch that people are like, yeah, sign me up. I think the average person just really wants like more of their years lived to be healthier, like to be lived at like a 20 to 30 to 40-year old's like bodily capability to be able to move and enjoy things at that level. Um, that can be extended, like that's quality of life added, right?
Mhm.
Um, and the features by which we get there end up not so much being um, that intervention is the solution. You would kind of hope that the way that we get there is that like culturally and the way our societies are set up just allows the general behavior of a person to be much more wellness oriented, right? That like we have a lot more, again, like 90% of the problem is like the food we eat, how much sleep we get, like how much we overwork ourselves, how much sunlight we get. But you can add like, yeah, you can throw in these peptides and personalized medicines. And I think it ends up being really critical when you're in like your 40s and 50s where like some adverse condition can hit you and all of a sudden like the drugs available then end up, I think, being very path deciding, or I guess like longevity deciding. But in the years leading up to that point, in the years while you're in your 40s, 50s, like, like get your parents to lift weights because lifting weights has shown how much it supports like or resists bone decay that happens with age. Stuff to that effect that like we society has never been this way. Like I guess our world has never been structured that like the older you get, the more natural ways are for you to stay like as mobile and agile as you might have once been. But you would hope that like between preventative medicine, there's a little bit of like preventative culture, that kind of gets baked into the technologies of our time and the way that we take care of um, folks who are aging, that sort of thing. That longevity truly ends up being a matter of like, it's not metrics. It's not like consume or like drug yourself with a thing. It is ultimately like, is your life better shaped to be healthy?
Yeah, I mean, I think one other important factor to consider, even if medicine and our diagnostic, sensor methods don't improve, we really haven't lived through an aging generation yet that made physical activity for the sake of remaining healthy part of their
Yeah.
routine. Meaning, like
Yeah.
most of the kind of boomer, et cetera, generation grew up in a world through their adolescence, through their early adult years, into kind of their midlife, right? Into their 40s and their
Mhm.
50s, into beyond, without ever really being conscious of the ideas of physical education. Now, that said, a lot of them did work more blue collar style jobs. They got physical activity more passively. That we also have
Yep.
the largest cohort ever that kind of sit at a desk all day for their jobs. That's a little bit confounding here. But the point that I'm making is people didn't run for leisure until really
Yeah.
like the 2000s. A little bit in
Yep.
the 90s and kind of, like there was like the fad fitness era of the 80s. But all I have to
Yeah,
say,
with like the
like
tube
most.
socks and everything.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
in-home DVDs and all this kind of thing kind of
Yeah.
became popular around that time. But the point that I'm making is we really haven't run just even the natural control study of if I told you it was important when you were 18 years old to exercise forever and you did, how long do you live? We just really don't know what that looks like.
Yeah.
And again, that may
Like
in and
there's
of
no
itself.
longitudinal study that
No,
has
no,
done
because no
that. Yeah.
one, yeah, because no one that had was conscious of kind of their health as an active choice is old
Yeah.
enough to even know yet.
Yeah. And I mean, a quirk there is that there's also very little reason to sponsor that kind of study because there's nothing to
Yeah,
pay
no,
for,
there's no commercial gain there. Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Like
That's right.
there's no advantage to like test the results of that because it is just like a public wellness and good effort without something to sell at the end.
Yeah,
Um,
perhaps a conversation is yet for a different day, but I do wonder if that's solvable from some business alignment incentive as well. Like, I do think it's an interesting discussion to
Interesting.
have to think about how would you create some sort of economic flywheel that
Yeah.
incentivizes both the user and the provider to stave off both the kind of medical industrial complex, if you want to call it that, right? Both the diagnosis
Yeah.
and the prolonged treatment of these chronic diseases and things.
The dystopian answer would be our like BCIs and whatever depend on our biology being up and
Right.
good.
That's
So
right.
if you want your BCI chips working as great
So
as possible for
you
as long as
can,
possible, you better be keeping your nervous system healthy.
you can only generate real world robotics data if the biology is stable enough to generate the data. That's right.
Exactly. There you go. So I hope everyone stays healthy so you can feed the Matrix when that eventually comes along. Should be good, everyone. Anyway, we're up there. That was interesting. I mean, I do want to dig. I think that like prompt you gave about the business practices, how do you like make wellness like both user serving and actually like industry serving, does feel so like arcane. Like it feels
Mhm.
obtuse to me as to like
Mhm.
imagine how that would work, but it's obviously important.
Mhm.
So maybe more worth digging into there. But we'll see. In any case, we'll stop there for now. If folks have questions, comments, etc., this topic's fascinating to me because I just like live in this circle of people who like love this stuff for no reason. But I do think that there's a lot of like public discourse around this that's like both unhealthy but also scientifically very provoking. That's worth having very sided discussions and being very opinionated about. But in any case, we'll catch y'all later. Thank you all for joining us this Saturday morning, and we'll see